Okay, so chapter 7.2, we're going to talk about simple interest, and we're going to add a little more to this, so it's going to get a little more complicated. But essentially, we'll start out with the same idea as before. We're going to say sum. So we're going to ask the same question that we've been asking before. So the question we're going to ask now, we're going to word it a little differently, is some percent of a starting amount of money is something we call the interest. And these ideas I put in parentheses here. I'll highlight them red. Think of these as your values or variables from before. So I could write this as a percent. Typically, we'll write this as R times, and a starting amount of money, we'll often call this P. I'll tell you why in a second. And R times P equals the interest, I. Except we have one addition. When people are dealing with money, sometimes they want to do this calculation over a period of time. So we need to add one little thing here. So I want to add the phrase over some time. And this then also translate into a times T. So what we end up with here is interest equals P times R times T. So here I equals interest. P is the principal, or our starting amount. R is the interest rate, and T equals time. And if I set this up, if I set my R up, if I relate my R to T, and I say that we're talking annual interest rate, annual each year, then time is in years. If we set it up like this, then we call this simple interest formula. But as you can see, we're just doing the same thing we did before, except we added a third term here. This is a reasonably easy relationship to memorize, and it's probably a pretty good one to memorize if you have to memorize something. So let's look at an example of how we might use this. Okay, so say you borrow $73 from the local mobster, and he charges 8.5% annual interest, and he expects you to pay once a year. And he also expects you to pay the $73 back at the end of the year. So at 1 year, how much total do you owe? Well, we can use this relationship, I equals PRT. And when we're doing problems like this, I would suggest you write your variables over here when you pick them out of the word problem. Sometimes they're not that easy to pick out, but this one is reasonably simple. So our principal, the money we borrowed, the starting value, was $73. Our rate is 8.5%. Now make sure you write this rate in terms of a decimal, 0.085 then. And the time is just 1 year. If it was more than 1 year, this would go up. If it was 3 years, that would be 3, so on and so forth. 5 years, that would be 5. Okay. So the solution here, our interest then, equals plug these in. 73 times 0.85 times 1. So the interest we owe is $6.25. Now that's just the interest. Again, if we want our total, then we might say our total amount. Might just want to abbreviate that with A. This equals, so I've written it out here, equals our principal plus our interest here. I expanded out the interest, PRT, that we did up here. This is going to be $73 plus $6.23. So the total we owe is $79.23. So we're paying interest for the luxury of borrowing money. Now notice, this equation here, we could pull the P out, and this will be 1 plus RT equals the amount that we owe, A. Now, I don't think you need to memorize this equation here. The only thing you really need to concentrate on is the I equals PRT, and then just use logic to determine what you need to determine. So in summary here, you borrowed $73 at 8.5% annual interest rate. After a year, you had to pay an additional $6.25 in interest, and the total was $6.23 plus the original amount, $73, equals $79.23. Okay, so we have this formula for simple interest. Well, we could use some algebra, and we could convert this to a formula for the principal. If you know what your interest amount is, divided by RT. I just took and I divided both sides here by RT. You could take this original equation and I could solve for R. R equals I over PT. Or we could take this equation and we could solve for time. I over PR. Now, I don't see any point to memorizing these four equations. All you really need to know is this equation here, and then figure out what your values are. As long as you have 3 of the 4, you can solve this any of these equations. Determine what you have. Say you have a principal, say you have an interest rate, and say you have the actual interest. You could solve then, you could calculate for time, how much time it is. All right, if you're a little confused, let me demonstrate this idea with an example. So here's an example. The company borrows $18,000, maybe to cover its salaries during the shutdown, and plans to repay $26,000 in 3 years, pay back $26,000. So that's the principal plus interest in 3 years. What is the simple interest rate? Well, okay, let's use our simple interest formula. I equals PRT. Now let's see what variables we have. Okay, the principal. We have the principal. That's our starting value. We borrowed $18,000. What's our rate? Well, we don't know that. That's actually what we're looking for. What is simple interest rate? Time. Well, that's pretty simple. 3 years. So we have this variable. We have possibly, do we have I here? Well, it doesn't tell us what in this problem what I is, but we can calculate it because we can take 26,000 and subtract our principal, and we can figure out how much we paid in interest. And that comes out to $8,000. So let's see what we have now. Let's stick this stuff in our equation. So we have, for interest, we have 8,000 equals principal is 18,000. R we don't have, and T is 3. So all we have to do now to figure out what this R is solve for it. So we divide both sides. Excuse me. We divide both sides by essentially 18,000 times 3. 18,000 times 3. So we didn't change the equation. This cancels, this cancels, this cancels. So we're left with R equals 8,000 over 18,000 times 3. And that's 0.15, or an interest rate of 15%. Pretty high. Here's another problem. Say you determine you need $1,200 a month to live. Food, rent, so on and so forth. How much money at 8% annual rate should you save so that you can live off of the interest? Okay, so let's use our I equals PRT to solve this. All right, so question is, what do we have here? Well, we have a rate. That's easy. Let's go 0.08. Do we have the principal? Well, we have $1,200 a month, but that's what we need to be our interest that we make. That's what we want to live on. So we want to have a principal. We want to have a very big amount of money in the bank so that it collects interest, and enough interest to give us $1,200. So that's our interest. The next tricky idea, what is the time? Well, we've normally been using years, but we're talking about a time of just a month. That's less than a year. And in fact, there are 12 months in a year. So really, for time, we're looking at 1/12 here, 1/12. So here I populated the formula. Now I solve for P, and the answer is 180,000. So you need 180,000 in the bank if you want to live off the interest, which will be $1,200 a month.